Welcome to Casual Friday. Today I'm going to talk about some challenges that I've had with the sweater I've been knitting and how I overcame those challenges. As I was working through the possible solutions to my challenges, I made some observations about preferences that knitters have that are not always the same in terms of sweater construction. And then I want to talk about what makes a good first sweater project. There's a particular recommendation that is often given to knitters looking for their first sweater project that I don't tend to agree with. And I'll be talking about why I don't agree with it and why you may come to a different conclusion than I have. So let's get started. So I'm a lot further along in the sweater that I have been working on. It's all joined. I have the body and the sleeves have been knit and they've been joined together. So I'm working on the top of the sweater and doing raglan decreases right now. And I talked last week about how I like to pick a 3-week sweater project in the fall and how I sort of have a feeling about what that is, and then I looked at the numbers and I saw what the common denominator was in those projects, which was they tended to have 50 to 55,000 stitches, which for me takes me about 3 weeks to do. Now this sweater is a 36,000 stitch sweater, and the pace that I'm keeping at is going to probably mean that I'm done at about day 15 or day 16, which is right in line with the sort of stitch count per day that I tend to knit. And so it's not too surprising. So I should probably have this done on Sunday or Monday, and then I'll wash and block it and buy some buttons, and hopefully I'll be able to wear it next week for next week's Casual Friday. So I've been a little concerned about the amount of yardage I'm going to need for this sweater and whether or not I really have enough. So I've shown you some of my spreadsheets in the past, and one of the things that I do is I calculate the total number of stitches that this sweater is going to have, or this project is going to have. And then I keep track of where I am every time I finish a ball of yarn, so I can kind of keep track of what the average number of stitches I get out of a ball is, and then I can project whether or not I'm going to have enough yarn to complete the project. And this one is pretty close. It looks like I have enough yarn to knit about 38,000, maybe 38,000 and a couple hundred more stitches, and this sweater is going to be about 36,000 and about 400 or 500 stitches. So it's pretty close, but I'm confident I have enough. So with this project, I'm getting exactly the gauge called for. I'm using the exact yarn called for in the pattern just because it turned out I liked it, and so I ordered it. And I'm knitting the same size the designer knit in the pattern. So I'm pretty confident that the estimate for the number of balls was accurate. So this pattern has a 12-row repeat. So there's a few different stitch patterns, but they all repeat every 12 rows. And my row gauge is 11 rows every 2 inches. So it's a 12-row repeat. That means every repeat is just a little bit more than 2 inches long. And so that meant that with the ribbing, the 2-inch ribbing at the bottom, and then 6 of the repeats up for the body, when I had completed 6 repeats of the stitch pattern for the body, I was right at the 15 inches that the body needed to be. For every one of the sizes in this pattern, the body is supposed to be 15 inches long, and the sleeves are supposed to be 18 inches long when you join them all together. So with this 12-row repeat, it struck me that it would be easiest if I was at the same place in the repeat for both the sleeves and the body, so that when I joined them together and I was working across all of the stitches, I would know that I'm always in the same row of the stitch pattern. I wouldn't have to think about that. But the problem is that for the sleeves, the body, remember I had 6 repeats, to get 15 inches. The sleeves, I did 7 repeats and I was at 17 inches. And the sleeves were supposed to be at 18. And they are meant to be a little bit longer. They're meant to come down about halfway down the hand. So I knew that the sleeves were supposed to be longer than average. So my challenge was, well, do I knit the body and the sleeves a little bit longer so that the sleeves can be 18 inches and they'll still be at the same row for the repeat for all sections of the sweater? Or do I just knit the sleeves longer and then have the patterns not be the same as I knit them? That I thought was going to be a problem just because I knew I would make mistakes and that it would be a challenge and I'd be making a lot of mistakes that I would have to fix. So a third option would be to just knit the sleeves for a full repeat longer, which would make the sleeves 19 inches or a little more than 19 inches long. And that seemed like maybe it was way too long. The other problem was that if I knit both the body and the sleeves longer, I was going to run out of yarn. I wouldn't have enough yarn based on the stitch counts that I was getting for every ball of yarn. So if I were going to do that, then I would need to order more yarn. I didn't get it at a local shop. I ordered it online. So there was a potential of not having the same dye lot available to me. So one way around that would be, oh, well, when it was time for the button bands and the neck, it's a shawl collar, and it's all done at once. You pick up one side up around the neck and down, and then you knit this shawl collar and the button bands all at one time. So one solution would be, oh, well, just knit the button bands and neck with the yarn. If it were in a different dye lot, then you just do that. But the problem with that was it's going to take more than one ball of yarn to knit that. So then I'd have to order potentially 2 extra balls of yarn. So I was having these problems trying to figure out how am I going to solve this problem and how do I know if these sleeves are actually long enough, because I can put the sleeve on and I don't actually know where up my arm it's going to hit once it joins to the body. So I happened to be on Wednesday, I went to this new knitting group that I had learned about when I was at the Weavers retreat that I went to a few weeks ago. A couple of people invited me to come to this knitting group. It's at a library. And I didn't go last week, but I thought I'm going to go this week. So I went there and I was working on one of my sleeves for the sweater. And it was at the point where either I needed to join or I needed to decide what I was going to do. Am I going to join? And then if I do, what do I do if the sleeve is too short? So just talking through the problem out loud with other knitters was really helpful to me, because the one thing I didn't think of is the solution that I came up with. And one of the women there said, well, what does the cuff look like? And so as soon as I lift the sleeve up, I went, oh, because she had the same idea, that she had the idea that I then realized what she was talking about, is that if I needed to, I could remove the ribbing from the sleeve, pick up the live loops, and then knit the sleeve in the opposite direction with enough length to make it long enough with whatever yarn I actually do have left at the end. So that's my solution. So I thought, okay, I'm going to go ahead and join everything, and then if the sleeves aren't long enough, I'll take the ribbing out and then re-knit it going in the opposite direction. But this morning I realized, oh, I have one other raglan sweater in my sweater cabinet. It's the sweater that I over-dyed twice in the past 10 years. And it is the only raglan that I own. And I thought, I'm going to measure the sleeves on that raglan and measure the depth of the armhole and see how that compares to this cardigan. And it turns out the sleeve length on my raglan pullover is 17 inches to the underarm, which is what I have for this cardigan. And the depth of the raglan armhole is 8 1/4 inches, and that's what this sweater is calling for. So I'm sure now that it will fit, but if for some reason I decide I do want longer cuffs, I do have a solution for that. One of the things that has been really nice about working this project, because I had to do that joining, I had knit 2 sleeves separately from the body and then I had to join it all, is that I have a set of interchangeable knitting needles. So I didn't have to move anything to another knitting needle or to waste yarn. When I was done with that section, I could just take the tips off of the cords and then put the tips on another set of cords and then knit the next piece. And so it's been really nice having this really long cord when I had to join everything together. I have this one really long cord. But now that I've been doing decreases, this cord, I've never thought about a cord for flat knitting being too long, but this is too long, because what's happening is that as I am wanting to knit off of my left needle, the sweater is just wanting to spread as far out as it can along all of this cable. And it's hard to kind of shove the stitches along the cable. There's no resistance to it. It's not like a stiff needle where you can just shove things along. So I'm going to switch to a shorter cable at this point so that it'll be easier to move my stitches along. I don't use my interchangeable needles very often as interchangeable needles. And when I make blankets, I frequently do that, especially if I'm knitting it in pieces or if I'm doing a I-cord border all the way around, so I'm picking up stitches on 4 sides, and then I'll use the cables. But I really don't use them otherwise as interchangeable needles. I tend to use fixed length needles. Either my interchangeables always stay on the same cable and I just never take the tips off, or I use a fixed length circular needle. Now it took me a while to get to this point. I remember when I first moved to Minnesota, so I'd been knitting couple 3 years by then, and I noticed that every time I went to the yarn shop I had to buy another set of needles, and it always added to the expense. Like if I was knitting a little gift and I wasn't making very much money, then and I had to buy 2 sets of needles, it just seemed, it just made that gift more expensive because I was always buying needles. Now that's part of being a knitter, is at the beginning is you're going to be buying needles. And that's part of the appeal for a lot of knitters in the interchangeable sets. And when I first saw an interchangeable set at the yarn shop that I frequented at the time, I thought, oh, this is a great idea. And I bought the set, and I can't remember the brand. It was probably one of the only brands that were available at that time. This would have been the early or late 80s. So I'm thinking it was Boy, except they're not aluminum tips, they're plastic tips, and the cords are really thick and very stiff, which would be a problem for me now. The problem for me then, though, was that they weren't straight needles, because at the time I was used to using 14-inch long straight needles, and I would anchor them at the junction of my hip and thigh, so they'd point straight up and just sit there, and I would touch it but not hold it. And I would just knit like that with the needle held straight up. So when I had a circular needle, the problem was I couldn't anchor it that way. I had the little tip and I could anchor it down in my lap, but then I was not knitting in the position that I was comfortable in. And I didn't like the plastic tips. I didn't like how hard it was to move things. I hated them. So I put them to the side and I never used them. Well, when I took that knitting hiatus from like 2000 to 2005, when I wasn't really doing much knitting at all, certainly wasn't buying any yarn at the time, when I returned to knitting and I found real knitters in real life and I found knitting groups to go to, I was starting to knit other types of projects like hats and things like that. And I found that I really, I always had the right size circular tip, but I never had the right size cable, and I was still always buying needles. And that's when somebody suggested to me an interchangeable set. And this was, I don't know if Knit Picks was a new company then, but they were new to me. And they had just come out with their interchangeable needle sets. And so I bought a set thinking, okay, now I'm not going to have to buy any more needles. And then I realized, okay, but none of these tips can turn into a 16-inch needle because the 16-inch circulars have shorter tips. And so then I was like, oh, I'm still stuck having to buy 16-inch circulars. And that's when someone in my knitting group said, oh, but you could just do magic loop. And I was like, man, what's that? So then I found out what magic loop was, and then I learned about traveling loops. So then Once I didn't need a 16-inch circular needle and I learned magic loop, I realized I didn't need really interchangeable needles because a 32-inch circular needle would do everything I needed to do. I could knit in the round like a sweater. I could knit flat. I could knit hats using traveling loop and then switching to magic loop. I could knit tiny circumference things with only magic loop. So the whole idea of the interchangeable needles didn't really matter to me. But for this particular project and for some projects, they have made a huge difference. So I do like having them and I do use them once in a while, but it's not very common that I actually use my interchangeables as interchangeables. So it's really, it's nice to be able to use a tool that you have and use it as the tool was intended. So when I was at this knitting group and I was talking through the challenge that I was having with getting these sleeves to come out right to the right length, somebody said, well, that's why I always knit top-down raglans. And I said, oh, I hate top-down raglans. It's like the worst. Like of all of the choices, that's my least favorite way of knitting any kind of sweater. And she said, really? I just love it because you get all the stuff you have to focus on just happens right at the beginning, and then you can just sail on through and you don't have to think about it at all. And I thought, oh, that's so funny because that's exactly the reason that I hate it, that I hate top-down raglans. So for me with a sweater project, I like to keep this balance between engagement and frustration. Like I don't, when I'm learning the stitch pattern, because I almost always have a stitch pattern that I'm working in a sweater. So I rarely knit a stockinette sweater. And if it is stockinette or mostly stockinette, there's usually some element to it that makes it more interesting other than just being stockinette. Because even with socks that I knit that are mostly stockinette, I found that it's the self-striping yarn that keeps me engaged. So waiting to see what color is coming up next is what keeps me interested, and seeing how the whole color sequence works out, and then as I'm knitting, like, oh, only 2 more stripes until I'm done with the repeat again. So there's something about that keeps my attention. Whereas the first time I ever knit a sock that just used a variegated yarn, it was like different colors of pink, it had dark pink and light pink, and it was a really pretty yarn, and it made a pretty sock. I was so bored. It took me 10 years to knit the second sock. So I learned, like, okay, there has to be something to engage me, because plain stockinette round after round after round with nothing else to engage me drives me nuts. So for me, with a sweater, I really like to knit at least the body bottom up, because there's typically little to any shaping in the bottom. And I really like working stitch patterns. That's the thing that keeps me engaged, especially at the beginning, as I'm learning the stitch pattern, seeing how it repeats, and I don't have to worry about the shaping. So by the time I get to the underarm, when all the shaping is happening, that's when I'm ready for the next challenge, because I already know the stitch pattern, so now I can do the shaping. If I work top down with a stitch pattern, I have to learn the stitch pattern and I have to keep track of all the shaping. And with a top-down raglan, there are so many places to make a mistake. You have the markers, and you're supposed to increase before and after each marker, and then you have front neck stuff that's going on, and it's just a lot to keep track of at the beginning. And if you're only knitting stockinette, then it's not so bad. But like I said, I really dislike only knitting stockinette in a sweater. So by the time I got to the underarms, I would be going insane thinking about the fact that I have this whole body to do, and then 2 sleeves. So for me, it's not a way to balance keeping me engaged in a sweater. So, but this bottom up sleeve thing is a frequent issue that I have. I know how long I want the body to be and how deep I want the armholes, But depending on the amount of ease I have and other things going on, I'm never entirely convinced I know how long I want the sleeve to be before I do any cap shaping if I'm going to do a set-in sleeve. So I really like knitting the sleeves top down. So the body bottom up and the sleeves top down. I like to use that combination. So I thought I'd show you some sweaters that I did knit top down and what it was that I liked or didn't at least didn't mind about that process. So this is a sweater I wore, I think a couple of weeks ago. It's called Stripes Gone Crazy. So you have the narrow and the thick stripes in the front, and the body's knit in one piece. And what's interesting is that these stripes in the back are done in short rows. So this is stripes, so I had to change colors every so often, which kept me kind of interested. And then the short rows really kept me engaged. So I didn't mind the stockinette because there was other stuff I had to keep track of. So this is one where it's a set-in sleeve, simultaneous set-in sleeve. That means you start at the shoulders and you're knitting the set-in sleeve at the stitches for the set-in sleeve at the same time that you're knitting the body. So it's sort of like a raglan in that way, in that you're knitting the sleeves and the body at the same time, but it's a different shaping. You have the straight armholes down, and it's the sleeve cap that's getting all the shaping, rather than creating these sort of triangular shapes. So that's one. This is another one, and again, this one isn't mostly stockinette. Certainly at the very top where the shaping is happening is mostly stockinette, but there's a little bit of a design down the front, and that design is a little bit of color, but it's also there's some texture in there that you may not be able to see, those little rectangles, and they're down the back also. And this one is also another one that is simultaneous set-in sleeves, top down. It's really helpful to learn that technique while you're doing stockinette, but there was the stitch pattern that was interesting. Do I have texture coming up in this round, or is it color, or what am I going to do? So that kept my interest. So after I knit this one that I just showed you, I was really intrigued by the idea of the top-down set-in sleeve, but I also recognized the challenge of introducing a textured stitch pattern and how much that would require paying attention. I had designed a sleeve. I had bought some yarn as like a birthday gift for myself. It was a hand-painted, probably Madeline Tosh something or other. And it was a special yarn, and I wanted to make myself a special sweater, and originally I'd intended on making something really simple with it and just letting the yarn do the work, but I didn't like the way it looked in stockinette. It needed some sort of texture to make the color work better for me anyway. And I asked a couple of other people, and I was showing them the stockinette swatches versus a textured swatch, and they tended to agree. So I designed this sweater, and I would have preferred to have knit it bottom up, but there was something very specific that I wanted to happen in a very specific place on the front. So you can see how I have the front has that kind of diamond cable that goes up into the neck, and I wanted it to end exactly there. I mean, I knew exactly how deep I wanted my armholes, and you can do gauge, and you can be on gauge over 4 inches, but over the course of 16 or 18 inches, the tiniest fraction of gauge off gets amplified. And so I really wanted to make sure that cable was exactly, a certain place below where the neckline was going to be. And that meant I was going to need to knit it top down and start it at the place that I wanted it to be. And then I could make the length, I could adjust the length and what the cables were doing at the bottom based on what the row gauge actually ended being and how it fit me. But this was something where I did saddle shoulders, and then I did the top down set-in sleeve, and I had this texture pattern going on with this complicated cable on the front and this cable on the back, and then I had cables going down the center of the sleeve, and it was kind of ridiculous. I mean, I'm happy with how it turned out. But it was not an experience that I would willingly repeat. Again, I would have preferred to knit the bottom knit the body bottom up and then done the sleeves top down, but it just wasn't going to work for this particular sweater. But I have a lot of sweaters where I knit the body bottom up. I've worn this one many times, and then the sleeves were knit top down. Probably half my sweaters are knit that way. It's just, that's my preference if I can do it. So for the sweater that I'm knitting right now, I really liked that the body was knit bottom up because I could establish that stitch pattern, and the same for the sleeves, so I was happy with that. And because it's raglan, all the pieces have to be knit in the same direction. So I'm not opposed to top-down construction, but for me, I need a reason in order to do that, because unlike the woman who said, oh, I love getting all of the futzing stuff done first and then having clear sailing after that, I really need that balance, and so I look for ways of making that happen for me. So this discussion in the knitting group about the top-down raglans was really enlightening to me, because I never imagined that people actually enjoyed knitting top-down raglans. That's a total prejudice of mine. I just like it so much that I assumed that people only did it because they thought they were supposed to, or they didn't know that they had other choices that could work just as well for them. Putting my prejudices, pushing them to the side, I would say that if you want to knit your first sweater, that it's worth thinking about a few things when it comes to your knitting. First, have you ever knit a project of that size? Or anywhere near it? Like, what are the projects that you have knit previously? And are you the type of person who, if knitting gets to be a real slog, are going to be really unhappy and not finish it? Or are you going to stick with it even though maybe you're beginning to hate it? Like, would stepping up from doing, say, a hat to knitting a sweater, would that be such a big leap in terms of project size that you might have a problem with it? Do you know yourself, like, what your attention span is? The second thing is, how much do you enjoy knitting stockinette? Is that really going to be your choice for knitting a sweater, or would you prefer some sort of a stitch pattern, whether it's a very simple texture pattern or a cable or something that you could learn on the project, but once you got the hang of it, it would be easy sailing. Like, what do you need to keep yourself engaged in a project? How much do you enjoy learning? Like, some knitters really like just knowing what they're doing and then knitting the same thing over and over and over and over again. And that is what makes them comfortable with their knitting. Where other people are constantly getting bored and want to learn something new every time that they knit a project. Another thing to think about is whether you really need to knit an adult sweater your first time out. My own first knitting project was a sleeveless V-neck summer top, and it was simple and it was cute. I liked the color and I liked the yarn I chose, and it was a very simple top, and I did wear it. I wore it a lot and I really liked it, but it was very simple to knit. So when you're looking at things that are simple, that have very simple lines, think about, is that something that I will actually wear, or is that something that I could, or am I looking at it because I think it's something I can knit? Because sometimes things are easy to knit and you get done with it and you're like, I would never wear that out of the house. So what are you trying to gain by when you knit your first sweater project? Are you trying to just get through the project and see what it's like and learn all the techniques that are involved in knitting a sweater? Or are you trying to produce a garment that will fit you and that you will wear? That's another consideration, is what looks good on you. Like, when you're picking a sweater pattern, sometimes you look at things, you think, well, that's a really great sweater, I'm going to make myself that. But think about how many times you've been at the mall, you think that's a great dress or whatever, and you try it on, it looks terrible on you. It fits you, but it looks terrible on you. So one of the things to think about are what sorts of attributes that a sweater has that would look good on you. Do you look good in V-necks, or do you a scoop neck, or do you a turtleneck, or what are those kinds of neck things look good on you, and what sorts of sleeves look good on you? Do you look good in a raglan? Some people don't. People with narrow shoulders tends to accentuate them, where people with broader shoulders look just fine in them. So think about that too. So while my first project was for me, it was a very simple project, my second one was for my little nephew. So it was a baby-sized sweater. It had a V-neck, it had button bands, and it had sleeves, and it had a very simple stitch pattern. So it had a lot of new things that I hadn't done before, but I did them all one at a time. I learned the stitch pattern first while I was knitting straight, and then I learned to do to knit the sleeves, and then I learned to sew them in. I learned how to pick up stitches. You know, there were a lot of things that I learned step by step, and it was all on a very small scale. It looked very cute on my little nephew. It didn't matter how well it fit, and that it fit him for any long period of time. So I was able to get through all of the steps, but I didn't pick a sweater pattern that was so easy that it didn't give me any of the features that an adult sweater would have. So that's another thing I would recommend is if you want to start on a smaller scale, pick something on a smaller scale that has all the attributes of a sweater that you would want to have in your own sweater. So I'm not saying that a first sweater project shouldn't be a top-down raglan or even a bottom-up raglan. What I'm saying is that there are more options than just a top-down raglan, and there could be some that you would like just as much or even better. I think it's a great idea as you progress through different sweater projects that you try different construction methods. I think it's a good idea to explore top down and bottom up and even the combination of the two. It's a good idea to try stitch patterns while you're knitting instead of just plain stockinette, because that can be really boring for a lot of people. Other people would prefer that. And it's good to explore different types of sleeves and armhole constructions, not just the raglan, but the set-in sleeve, the drop sleeve, the modified drop. There's all kinds of different sleeves that are fairly simple to do and are worth exploring because you may find that you prefer them much more than the raglan construction. So if you're thinking about knitting a sweater for the first time, consider that there is no best or correct or easiest sweater construction for a first-time sweater knitter. Instead, think about what you want the sweater to look like, what appeals to you, what is it that you are going to want to wear, and also consider whether you want to start on a smaller scale with a child or baby-sized sweater where getting a perfect fit isn't really that imperative because the child's going to either grow into it or grow out of it. You can learn a lot about the process of knitting a sweater on a much smaller scale in a shorter length of time. So you can figure out whether sweater knitting is even something that you enjoy doing and whether you'd want to do it on a larger scale, or if you liked it but would like to try a different construction method, either the direction of construction, bottom up versus top down, or vice versa, or whether you'd like to try a different sleeve type or a different neck type, how you'd like to combine that with stitch patterns. You have a ton of choices when it comes to making sweaters, even when it's your very first one. So if you like my videos, you can support me on Ko-fi.com. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.